The difference between 7 and 8 is bigger than you might think. If you ask AMD today, the difference between the 6700 XT and 6800 is 1280, or about an increase of 50%. A year ago, the difference between 7 and 8 was, well, infinite. Not so long ago, however, an RX 470 was 90% of the core count of an RX 480 at 90% of the price. What was pretty much a non-decision for the average consumer back then might mean for a stone-cold bargain today. Another day, another Sapphire Nitro card. While I'd love the shroud design on these cards, I can't help but crave a little bit of diversity in my B-roll. But it's the Scalper pandemic and we make do with what we've got. The card here is a 4GB variant of the RX 470, itself a less refined version of the RX 570. That refinement takes the form of a slightly more efficient power delivery, better clock speeds on RAM and GPU cores, and, well, that's about it. The price difference between the RX 470 and 570 should, in my opinion, be negligible, but that isn't always the case. Compared to the next model up, the RX 480, this card has 2048 shader units, compared to that card's 2304, and has a core clock speed of about 10% lower than most 480s. How this translates into real-world differences in gaming performance remains to be seen. We'll find out using the reasonably priced gaming PC, a £325 quad-core Ryzen-based machine that represents close to the average gaming PC according to Steam hardware survey results. Often the start of a new season in live service games like Fortnite can render previous testing irrelevant, which is a problem for me as I don't keep cards after I review them. Fortunately for me, the turning of the last season doesn't seem to have brought any major surprises. Competitive settings bring an average of 183 FPS and lows of 128. High settings, with epic view distance, still averages over 60 FPS and drops into the 40s. Both are about 5 to 10% less than the 4GB RX 480 scored in my video from the previous season. Apex Legends was a curious one from a pure comparison standpoint. I find it pretty hard to stay alive in this game for more than a couple of minutes, but overall the RX 470 4GB at 1080 low and the 4GB texture setting looks to have scored essentially the same as the RX 480 4GB did at the same settings. Doom Eternal again seems only incrementally slower performing on the RX 470 than it did on the 480, this time averaging just shy of 100 FPS and lows in the high 60s. This is somewhere around 5 to 10% slower than the RX 480, which might indicate the start of a trend. Call of Duty Warzone just dips below 90 FPS when playing at 1080 low, which, surprise, is about 5 to 10% slower than its big brother. Unlike the 480, however, on my 4 separate game runs, the textures in the intro, on scenery during the drop, and on distant buildings during gameplay all failed to load. A problem I'd previously assumed was more of an issue for sub 4GB cards. I guess Warzone just remains utterly unpredictable and something of a broken mess. At last, something different to report. The RX 470 recorded a frame of 51 FPS in Horizon Zero Dawn, testing at 1080 original settings. When compared to the 4GB RX 480, there is a margin of error difference between the two. Seriously, there's like 1 frame in it. And 2 frames in it with Watch Dogs Legion, seeing an average score of 57 FPS and lows of 43. Still arguably within the margin of error and not enough difference to be remotely meaningful. Assassin's Creed Valhalla's benchmarks are almost carbon copies of the 480s. 1080 medium scores 53 FPS on average and 33 low. Pushing up to high sees the averages drop to 40 and lows to 28. Resident Evil Village is where we see a real, frankly shocking difference between the two cards. Okay, actually that's a lie. Again, the 84 FPS average is only margin of error difference from the RX 484GB, with both cards tested at 1080 balanced, with texture set to 0.25GB in order to satisfy the game's hunger for VRAM. Here it is folks, the one title that's different. The RX 470 comes in a whole 10 FPS less than its bigger brother in Forza Horizon 4. The game still plays terrifically at 1080 medium or high. The former scores 92 FPS on average and 80 lows, and the latter 87 and 74 respectively. The drop is significant, but I'd suggest you take the other benchmarks into account before deciding if this difference is worth paying extra for. Finally, it's the big boy. Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080 actually outperforms my previous testing on the RX 484GB in both low and medium quality presets. Low sees a 48 FPS average and 35 1% lows, medium drops to 40 average and 30 low. The difference between the two cards is still pretty low, hardly more than a couple of frames in the 470's favour at either setting. It's possibly attributable to one of the two patches that have occurred between the two reviews, and if I still had the 480, I'd retest to see if that's the case. Alas, I don't have it anymore, and even if I did, it's a couple of frames. It's not the difference between playable and unplayable anyway. Averaging the averages sees the 4GB RX 470 scoring 76.1 FPS, split across all the titles and qualities tested. The Big Brother card scored 79.5. If pricing were completely fair, I'd only expect to pay a little over 4% more for the 480. As I paid a rather exorbitant $165 for my RX 470, I'd want to pay not much more than $172 for the 480. Okay, I'm being facetious, but you see my point, that this card is, for most practical purposes, identical to the RX 480. The difference that does exist isn't big enough to warrant paying more for. It also goes a long way to explain why AMD made the differences between models in the 5000 and 6000 series much greater than they did in the Polaris days. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.